to record this for various people. I think this idea that research can be violence can be quite challenging for many of us, those of us committed to producing research, who've worked for years in the university and who really believe that we're part of something meaningful, useful, and driven by a concern about society at large. But I think that we can't avoid these confronting realities. For me, something that I always hold very much in front of my gaze at all times when I think of higher education and the university as an institution is the tension that it inevitably has between its transformation goals or ideals, and that's transformation in all senses of the word. You know, transformation of the individual students who leave the institution with hopefully new ways of seeing and being in the world. Transformation of society, that having a university and society should be good for the public, and it should transform the way that society is able to interact with each other. And transformation, economic transformation, is often foregrounded as a major role of the university. And transformation of disciplinary knowledge, that it's in the university that we really challenge and build disciplinary knowledge in many ways. So transformation is certainly a goal of the institution, but it's often in tension with the shadow goal of the university, the hidden goal of the university, which is not transformatory at all, but is reproduction. The university as the space of reproduction of the status quo, the space of reproduction of society's injustices and inequalities. And given that the university is a social institution within society, it's not surprising that many of the darker aspects of our society, particularly the enormous inequalities of society in South Africa, it's perhaps not surprising that these are echoed in our universities. And if we don't have brave students and academics who are able to hold the shadow agenda of reproduction up to the light for us to see it, we will never be able to dismantle it if we can't articulate it and see it face on. So I'm really very, very pleased to have these academics with us today, and thoroughly excited and looking forward to this session. I think that Ntsundeni is going to talk first. So over to you. I'm going to try and make all of you co-authors. Co-hosts. Yes, great. I can hear you perfectly.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sue. That was a very befitting introduction. Although I don't know if you can call us brave, we struggled a lot in actually compiling this piece of work. If I can give a short, brief background of how it all started, we were invited. In fact, we all wrote, crashed an essay, put together funds to actually fund a book which should be titled Uptake, Use and Impact of Research on Higher Education in Southern Africa, edited by Professor Jan Botha and Dr. Gabrielle Field. And it will be published through the Sun Media Stellenbosch. We all then wrote motivations to be part of the project as young scholars or emerging scholars in higher education research, of which we were awarded. And we really thank the donors and the sponsors and Prof. Jan and his team for actually giving us an opportunity. This chapter was not supposed to be part of the book. Actually, it was not even planned. It was when we gathered at Stellenbosch, and as young people grappling with research and with our own struggles in our studies and developing our craft in research and integrating ourselves into the cultures and communities of research in our respective institutions, that this chapter was born. It was born out of the frustrations of young people, or should I say young Black professionals in higher education, with all the established norms, paradigms, beliefs, and ways of doing things. We were assisted by our pillar and our co-conspirator, Professor Prinsloo, who guided us through and actually pushed us to work on this chapter, and we titled it Research as Violence. I will hand over to Temwa, who will actually give the presentations, and the rest of the team will come towards the end to give their concluding remarks, and then we can open for Q&A sessions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ntsundeni. Temwa, are you able to? There we go. You've unmuted. Perfect. Let me stop sharing. There we go. I think you have a PowerPoint you want to share. There we go. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that great introduction, Sue and Louis. Let me jump right into it. Our main argument in the chapter is we try to argue that research is inherently violent. Now, that being said, we do not necessarily argue or say that all research is inherently negative. And why do we say that research is inherently violent? We argue that the modern research university through which our research emerges from is rooted in the colonial imaginary. And I'm not sure if my camera is on. Should I put it on?
Yes, you can do.
Okay, all right. But let me just continue. All right. So we argue that the modern research university is rooted in this colonial imaginary and has a history of producing and reproducing violence. That's making violence an inseparable attribute to research. Now, before we jump into the discussions of our argument, I think it's important to clear out a few terms or terminologies that we use. And we need to understand what is this colonial imaginary that we are referring to? What do we understand by colonial imaginary, and why is it a problem? So we understand colonial imaginary as a social imaginary, which may be a set of values, institutions, laws, and symbols through which people may imagine themselves or construct themselves as social wholes or social beings. And this social imaginary may also be common to a group of people or a social group, which may construct itself as being different. People may define themselves as being spiritually different from other people. In extreme cases, other people may define or construct themselves as being more superior. In other cases, more intelligent as other people. So there's that difference in which people define themselves. So it is within this understanding that colonial imaginary is understood and applied in this chapter. So within this colonial imaginary, there is a complex relationship between power and knowledge, meaning who has the power and who has the legitimate knowledge. The researcher, we argue that the researcher is the one that is in that position of power. And this makes research, research is that's not only powerful, but that becomes an act of power. So the researcher is in a privileged space of power, whereby the researcher may have the power to make meaning, the power to name, and the power to define. So as we work with data, because the researcher is in this privileged space to name, to make meaning and define their data and how they interpret it, this may result in different forms of violence, which we will unpack later. For example, data may be racialized. It may be defined in racial terms, which may be problematic. So the researcher becomes, because of this privilege of power, the researcher becomes epistemologically important or powerful, making research an important tool of making subjective interpretations or normative realities, which we might take for granted, but they may result in research. For example, in 2019, we know that there was research in the country where I would argue that subjective interpretations were made on the cognitive abilities or development of a certain racial group of women. In 2020 as well, we argue that there was research which made subjective interpretations on Black students. So these are problematic positions that the researcher takes, which may result in different forms of violence. So this complex relationship between power and research is pronounced, or it's more pronounced, or more visible in societies where knowledge production and research have been closely linked to colonialism, imperialism, and slavery. And we argue that research has supported, in many cases, has supported and legitimized these violent institutions, institutions of colonialism, imperialism, and slavery. So going back again in our understanding of this term of colonial imaginary, what do we understand by colonial imaginary? So this colonial imaginary is understood as a social construct that legitimizes ontological and epistemic privileges of the North. Within this construct, knowledge production is seen as inherent or must always conform to these ontologies or epistemologies of the North. And this construct is also very problematic, or has problematic dichotomies or binaries in the way that we treat data, in the way that we categorize data, in the way that we interpret data, which may result to different forms of violence, which takes us to the next term which we use in this research, which is violence. So how do we understand violence? Our understanding of violence is not limited to metaphorical interpretations, because we argue that if you only look at violence from metaphorical interpretations, such as symbolic violence by Rudo, it may be problematic in that we may understate the impact that violence has on a group of people by other people. We thus adopt a holistic understanding of violence in its physical form, but also in its social and cultural dimension, which actually gives violence its power and its meaning. Another critical term that we need to understand that we use, or that needs unpacking in the research, is when we say research is inherently violent. Just to recap as well, violent is not a synonym for negative in this argument we make in the paper. We don't assume or argue that all research is inherently negative. However, we argue that research is inherently violent because we understand research as flowing from a sustained colonial imaginary, which we've described, which has been embedded in violence, and also the attribution of power to a certain group of people or the Caucasian. So the universality of these epistemologies and ontologies of the North, which we know history has shown us that these were all enabled by the erasure or negation of the colonial subject or the research subject, will to power and knowledge. And no society on the face of the earth has actually been spared from this concept of colonial imaginary. We then end off the chapter with arguing that these different forms of violences, in whatever form they may emerge, physical violence, epistemic violence, or ontological violence, they're actually perpetrated by colonial unknowing, whereby there's a denial of the colonial wound or the pain that colonialism has caused on indigenous people. We also argue that there's some sort of deliberate or convenient amnesia of the colonial wound as we undertake research. Okay. Now, this imaginary that we've defined first arose with the concurrent birth of the European Renaissance and the initiation of the colonial project. Now, our African university actually arose from this colonial imaginary, and in the case of South Africa, more defined through apartheid. Colonialism was introduced, sustained, and maintained through violence and the disposition and erasure of the other. As an example that we use in the chapter, the 1959 Extension of Education Act, where the division of the division, or what we call the classification of universities, was legitimized through this act, whereby the universities were created based on ethnicity. So here the state decided who should go to which university, what should be taught at what university, who should be taught what, and what must be researched. And we see research playing a critical part in validating that apartheid project of creating separate universities based on race. A research by Wilcox in 1932, who conducted intelligent tests to prove that non-white and non-African speaking people had lower IQs, actually validated the creation of these universities. So we see this violence being validated and being legitimized by research undertaken by one of the South African universities. So an open question, actually we have an open question which we ask, as in, to what extent has higher education research been informed, or to what extent is it sustained by this colonial imaginary? So that is the question which we ask throughout our arguments. And this colonial imaginary has furthermore naturalized the European domination and projected a Western European perspective as the only universal blueprint for global designs. And the foundation of this construct is that Africans waited in a fog before they had no abilities to think, they had no abilities to reflect, and they also had no cognitive abilities until Europeans arrived. So in this chapter, we contextualize research on, research in, and research by higher education as being framed within the colonial power-knowledge relationship, where research choices are not innocent, but rather an act of power. So research needs to be understood and explored as originating from an inherent sustained violence of the modern colonial imaginary. So our discussions in the chapter are divided in 3 sections. We firstly start off by contextualizing and problematizing some of the taken for granted assumptions and definitions that we make in research, be it when we collect data, define data, or name data. And we argue that these taken for granted assumptions and definitions, if not challenged, they continue to produce and reproduce different forms of violence, which we will unpack later. So, for example, what is researched and how we research has got the risk of producing violence and reproducing violence. The colonial binaries of the researcher as the knower and the researched being the data subject, where we go in and cut open and mine and extract data for scientific progress, has got the danger of producing different forms of violence, which we do discuss later on. The use of reductive categories, which are deeply embedded in the epistemologies and ontologies of the North, are problematic. And there's also a risk of reproducing violence or producing violence, such as your gender binaries, which are not are limited to A and B or male and female. The higher education management information systems data that we use for staff and students is problematic. For example, we use racial categories where some people do not necessarily fit in those categories or identify themselves within those categories. And we know that these categories, these racial categories, black, colored, and white, originated from the Apartheid project, but we continue to use them so that we can track transformation progress in the country. But problematic in these categories is that other people are defined as other or unknown. So basically we are defining people, ontologically erasing people by defining them as other and unknown. So this is just a few examples of how these taken for granted assumptions and definitions may be violent because we erase people or remove people from our research data or how we define them. Secondly, we in our discussions of the chapter, violence is not only, we argue that violence is not only in what we don't research, for example, what we remove out of the data, but also in how we understand the data categories, how we do our sampling, and also the research processes. We need to be cognizant that these processes and how we understand data may result in different forms of violence. And then we close off the chapter by providing examples of violence to unmask the power relations between the researcher and the researched as the data object, and how knowledge may be manipulated, or how these power relations may inform knowledge production. It is a biased relationship whereby there may be a manipulation of what knowledge is seen as valid or what data is seen as valid, and thus making conclusions from such problematic categorizations or treatment of data. So just to recap, what is the main argument of the chapter? We basically argue that the research is higher education research is problematic or violent in that because it is deeply embedded in the modern research university, which was birthed in this colonial imaginary, which validated itself or legitimized itself through violence to subdue the other. It validated itself through violence to dominate the other. It also validated itself through violence to erase the other. And we argue that research has been part and parcel of the colonial project to validate it and to legitimize it, in particular higher education research, from social sciences to pure sciences. We've got examples that we give where different forms of violence have emerged. The other main argument that we make is that as long as the major drivers for the research agenda of what sets the agenda are responses to your institutional norms or cultures which are deeply embedded in this construct, such as your dominant corporate imaginaries perpetuated by funding regimes, commercialization, privatization of knowledge, it becomes very problematic, or that there's a risk of producing violence and reproducing violence. So we ask this question that if our research is deeply rooted in values of violence, or if we research, or if we reference research that has historically produced violence, are we then not standing on the shoulders of giants, and therefore as researchers today also reproducing and producing violence? So these are those questions which we pose. We do not entirely accuse people of producing violence. These questions we pose that researchers must be cognizant as they undertake their research, be aware of their blind spots. So lastly, we end off the chapter by providing examples of research or going deeper into understanding violence as research. So we first look at physical violence, we then look at ontological violence and epistemic violence. And we argue that different forms of violence are then perpetuated by colonial unknowing. So I'll just go through to explain these different concepts. Starting with physical violence. So physical violence has been used as a tool for domination and a tool for legitimation and validation of the colonial project. And we argue that research has played a critical part in legitimizing and validating the colonial project. For example, in South Africa, a veteran by the name of Dan Hussein in 1998, he testified at the Truth Reconciliation Committee, whereby he said his research team was involved in research that developed a bacteria that was designed to exclusively kill Black people. So here we see research actually being undertaken, resulting in or with an attempt to cause physical harm. And this is informed by apartheid, or informed by this colonial imaginary, and also results in the dehumanization of the people, the denial of the person as a human, but really getting them to a data object where such is done. Another international example that we provide in the research is by Marion Sims. Marion Sims is still known as the father of gynecology because of the scientific progress that he contributed to that science. Now, his history, he's got a very dark history in that he developed gyna techniques to do inspections and treat on women. But before these procedures and techniques were perfected, he practiced on enslaved women without using anesthesia. That's causing a lot of pain, a lot of harm. And this is a perfect case whereby research was causing physical harm, and humans were used as data objects to cut open, extract data for the advancement of research. So we see physical violence emerging as a result of research. Now, this dehumanization is informed by this colonial imaginary. Therefore, physical violence, we argue that physical violence has thus been used as a tool to justify ontological invisibility of the researched or the colonial subject. So ontologically, the Black is rendered invisible. The nature of being is denied. So this ontological erasure is a form of violence where a certain group of people are denied of their nature of being. And just to recap, as we say that there is a need to look at violence holistically. So in as much as we are looking at violence in its physical form, there's a need to look at the social and the cultural dimensions of violence that give violence its power and actual meaning. We therefore introduced in the chapter terms like symbolic violence by Rudo, where he explains that domination, exploitation, and subordination have been enacted as a non-physical force. And we then go on to explain terms such as epistemic violence and how it may emerge in research. So we define epistemic violence in 3 ways. For example, there's testimonial epistemic violence, whereby there is a silencing of the other as a knower. And with this becomes the delegitimizing of lived experiences. It may be, as an example, lived experiences of students, whereby the research that we undertake, because of our privileged positions as researchers, we decide what is valid data and what is invalid data. So this, through this testimonial epistemic violence, research subjects may be micro-invalidated, they may be delegitimized, they may be silenced, which then results in a form of violence, because people's ability to know is not acknowledged. Then there's distributive epistemic violence. This can be understood as limiting access to social structures. What type of social structures? A certain group of people may be limited to have access, for example, to good health services, to good education. In other cases, it may be access to structures of power, for example. Recently, there was a Moyo T report that was released, and in there, there's reference to where there is examples of distributive epistemic violences, whereby Black academics complain of not having access to certain social structures of knowledge, of power, where there are these invisible forums where decisions are made, where there are these invisible forums where knowledge is shared, opportunities are shared. People are shut out of these structures. Then there's discriminatory epistemic violence, where people are just discriminated because of their nature of being or their geographical location. So we've presented physical violence or the different forms of violence. We then close off the chapter by saying that these different forms of violences continue to be produced or reproduced through colonial unknowing, where violence in research is perpetuated through systematic invalidations, either through silencing or denial of the colonial wound, or through deliberate or convenient amnesia that colonialism or the history of violence has wounds, through the structures and the cultures, or through what we still value in our research. So this reproduction of ontological violence and the epistemic violence may be perpetuated or is perpetuated through our research, through how we look at data, missing data sets, exclusion of important issues by researchers. Remember, the researcher has got the privileged, has got the privileged position to define, to determine what is valid data, what is invalid data, and the position of the researcher to make those decisions may result, for example, in the invalidation of lived experiences, for example, of students at universities or staff at universities or other groups of people. It could be because of their gender, it could be because of their sex, their sexual orientation, or it could be because of their race. Omissions, data omissions, all these result in a form of silencing through research. The value and worth attached to different aspects by researchers and audiences may be biased in many ways. We've seen how research makes subjective interpretations, and this may result in the different forms of violence, or what we also argue, systematic injustice, where vulnerable people who've been dispossessed through forces such as sexism. There's data on sex, racism, data on race, and also the classism. There's also data on class. All this, the way we look at data, treat data, may result in different forms of violence. And also, given that research is interpretive, our research choices, categories, the naming, definitions, for example, when we undertake research, for example, on students at risk, we are naming students at risk. These definitions may become or are problematic because they materialize as a violence on bodies, where we objectify research objects, and violence that may then emerge, for example, through stigmatization. The data subjects that we are getting the data from may then experience violence through self-policing, and also through internalization of stereotypes. And these stereotypes are reinforced through how we define data, how we treat data, how we interpret data. And this manifests violently through oppressive ways. We also argue, just using student at risk as research taking higher education as an example, just as a reminder, we're not saying that research is inherently negative, but we're saying research is inherently violent. We know that student at risk research is helpful for students because it helps them to be successful through the system and graduate. But what informs models of understanding of what a quality student is? What informs that? And as long as we undertake this research, if this research does not address the structural and cultural constraints which puts this group of people or this group of students as being student at risk, our research then runs a risk of being forced generosity, as year in, year out, we find that the same type of group of people are data objects that we mine and that we name or categorize as student at risk, as an example. In closing, we're not suggesting that all research with good intent should be abandoned because of its mere potential to be inherently violent. However, we are emphasizing that researchers, given their privileged positions, need to be aware of their blind spots. So some take-home considerations and self-reflective considerations is that as researchers, we must ask ourselves questions when we undertake research. Is this research that I am undertaking important? And for whom is it important? Do I have to do this research? Am I the right person to do this research? What are the power dynamics? Can the source of knowledge be an authority over the knowledge that they provide? Remember, we are going out to cut open and extract data from these data objects. Can those data objects, if I may call them that, be the source of knowledge and authority on the knowledge that they provide to me? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Temwa. That was really great. Temwa, are we going? Yeah.
I'm going to hand over to my other colleagues to see if they have any inputs.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I'll just wait for the round of questions. I don't know if my other colleagues have input.
Thanks, Rudo. Ben, do you have anything? Ntsundeni's been putting some useful comments in the chat.
Yeah, I have commented already on the chat. I think I'll just keep on commenting and wait for questions as well.
Okay, great. Benjamin, do you have anything you'd like to add before we get going with the question and answer?
Yeah, I'll also comment on the chat, and if there's anything that I will add, I'll just raise my hand.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you for talking us through your thinking in the chapter, Temwa, and colleagues. I think you've really given us a lot to think about, and you end, I think, on a very, can I say, optimistic note, that the challenge is not one of suggesting that there are bad researchers or good researchers, though indeed there may be some clearly bad researchers, but more that we are all implicit, complicit, and that the challenge is for us to constantly ask questions of ourselves, of why are we doing the research who are we doing it with, and so on. I'm going to invite anyone who has a question to either pop it into the chat bar, or to use the raise hand button, or just put the letter M for microphone, and I can hand you the microphone to share your thoughts. There have been some really interesting comments in the chat bar already, and so Roxana is saying, you know, is there any way of escaping? Because universities are in society and therefore colonial by their nature, given our history, is there any way of escaping colonial violence? To which Ntsundeni says that, exactly as I've just said, I was quoting him, that as authors, none of us can claim innocence. And I think that that's really important. You can do research with really good intent and still have the power to harm. So it's about being aware of blind spots, he reminds us. The problem, of course, of being aware of blind spots is their very nature is that we are blind to them. So I think that for me really calls for collaborations and listening and working with people who may bring an understanding of our blind spots to us. And he goes on about the need for decolonizing research, understanding that as a far bigger process that involves both the colonizer and the colonized. Lalu asked an important question which generated quite a bit of discussion around the language of teaching and learning and what that means in terms of violence. Now, my own research with Chrissy Bowie actually suggests that some of the understanding that the language, the use of English as a language as a medium instruction, the biggest violence is probably not the one that we hear of the most. The one we hear of the most is the challenges it gives to understanding, because you're having to kind of do internal translation. But in fact, the biggest violence is in fact one of identity, in terms of feeling that one's language and identity just so closely linked that if your language is not deemed valuable or academic, in inverted commas, then that has huge implications for students' identity. Roxas are saying the need to recognize the limits of our decolonizing projects, the humility of making visible that we are not exempt. And yeah, a really important comment there, if anyone would like to read through, about accepting the inherent violence. Again, it's Ntsundeni who says, accepting the inherent violence in research brings to the fore our immense responsibility, so that we constantly question this. And there are just so many issues around this, yeah, I'm just sort of thinking even the ethics of where we publish and who gets access to what we've published. Even that, I see academic publication as an enormous part of the colonial project, or neo-colonial, if you'd like to call it that. And then Brenda asks a question that I'm going to put to all of you. She asks, how related is this presentation to the question of ethics in research? We've been talking about ethics quite a lot as a group lately, and we've been talking about how ethics has often been interpreted from the angle of risk aversion, and therefore the bureaucratic hurdles that need to be jumped over in order to avoid risk. And that's a quite different understanding of ethics to the one presented here. So let me stop jabbering and ask the authors if any of you would like to wade in about the relationship between the concepts you've provided us and the need for ethics in research.
Thanks, Sue. I actually wanted to comment on the language question.
Yes.
Someone asked, do you think the use of language as the main means of teaching and learning in schools and institutions of higher learning is violent? And I want to link it back to what you said about identity. So I think the question here is really beyond the child struggling with English language, and actually seeing language as a representation of culture, symbols, and identity. So let's take, for example, when writing this paper, we really had a challenge in how to define violence, because in English language, violence is almost narrowly defined as brute physical force with intention to cause harm. And then this harm can be epistemic, ontological, and all that. But then if you look, I'm Shona, so I can only speak for my experience. If I just look based on my lived experiences, in Shona, we have no such definition of violence. In Shona, for example, war means nirijonga, which means actually confusion. So that's how we define, let's say, war. It means confusion. When it comes to maybe gender-based violence, we can call something as rape as kumubata, which means to hold. And these are all forms of violence. So we have no word that says violence. So when you now want to engage, you find that the language actually excludes your lived experiences. So therein lies the violence. So when we say that something is violent, we are really trying to say that it's not about intentionality per se, because it is inherent in the practice. So the main object of research is really to, basically do that, right? It's to research. And for someone to conduct research, there has to be an object to be researched. And that's why we have ethics around research, so that as we are doing this work of objectifying and trying to understand people's lived experiences, we actually don't cause harm. So, and that's why all these conversations between subject and object, knower and unknowing, it's all these ethics trying to, prevent harm. But basically, the relationship I'm trying to bring out within language and violence is the same as in research as violence. So it's beyond intentionality to actually it being an inherent and inseparable part of the practice of, let's say, languaging and the practice of violence, of research. So it also brings us back to the point of Roxanne, where she was asking, are we able to escape violence in research? And I think this is where, for me, ethics are very important. Ethics are there because we realize that there's something about research that we have to protect people from, right? So it's not about escaping the violence itself, but it's actually acknowledging that as a researcher, I'm in a position of power. And that becomes my departure point when I'm actually engaging with people. Trying to distance ourselves and saying, oh no, my research, I'm actually, focusing a lot on gender studies, and myself, I'm Black, so it means that I have a bigger understanding of it. It's very a limited understanding of how research actually plays into these binaries. And by so doing and, actually denying your own privileged position as a researcher, you are actually perpetuating colonial unknowing, the denial of yourself in a privileged space of naming and knowing. So, yeah, I'm done.
Can I just then add on to what Rudo just said? This is Ntsundeni. On the question of ethics, we deliberately didn't use ethics in this chapter, but you cannot speak about violence in research and not mention the issue of ethics. And as Rudo was saying, the challenge with ethics or dealing with ethics in research is that ethics creates a reliance on others. It becomes some sort of a compliance and a tick box exercise, that you still get studies such as the recent ones in Stellenbosch and UCT going through ethical clearance committees, and they still get the approval to be done, and with the impact that the outcome of the research may have, whether it was planned or not. And this is the inherent sort of violence in research, in the methodologies that are used, and also the reporting of the findings of those research. So we didn't really mention ethics the chapter, but you cannot speak about research of violence and automation ethics. But the issue, as Rudo has said, is that the researchers themselves, we as the researchers, must know is to conscientize the researchers that they are the ones who have the power. And in everything that they do, they must be cognizant of the impact of their work on communities and to society. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think very useful, nuanced understanding of the relationship between today's conversation and ethics, and one which I think we'd all do very well to work through when we filling in, ethical clearance forms to really think through these issues. I'd like to just quickly raise 2 points that have come up in the chat. One, I think Ronelle makes a fabulous comment, and one that I almost want to sort of cut and paste it somewhere, where she talks about the calling out of forms of violence, and that unfortunately we often so defensive, and I think we've just recently seen that, where people have been called out for undertaking research which is quite frankly unethical, and that spend their time defending themselves instead of thinking, well, how can I think about this differently? What can I learn from this? And she says, I like the way that you as authors allow for all of us as researchers to be open about the possibility of perpetrating violence without being evil people. Perhaps that will reduce the defensive attitudes. And she then goes on to say, sometimes we actually quite like bash others, calling out, I can show how woke I am by showing how evil someone else is, instead of accepting, as you've done in your chapter, that all of us can potentially be violent in our research, and that we actually have a collective responsibility to be aware of that. And I think that reminds me so much of D'Angelo's book on white frailty, where she says that we have to paint racists and racism as an evil other, because it allows us to never actually accept our own responsibility for racism, because we make racism as something absolutely evil, and we never accept that actually people who think of themselves as good people are regularly racist. And I think, in white South Africans particularly battle with this, that we can be good people and still be horribly racist. And I think that's exactly what happens here. So I really want to echo her point that it's really great that the authors themselves have positioned themselves as susceptible to these same constructs, which makes much more possible, hopefully, for all of us to be reflective. And then a question that's come up there, which I'd like to put to you, Cassandra asks, is there a relationship between the colonial imaginary and institutionalized racism? Does the one allow or maintain the other, or how are those terms different? I don't know which of you would like to take that one.
Okay, I can take that one. I can see that Prof. Prinsloo is here, so maybe he can also jump in. I wish I was looking at the question, but I can't find it here. Could you just repeat it for me?
Sure, it's a bit higher up. Is there a relationship between the colonial imaginary and institutionalized racism? How are those two different terms? Does the one support or maintain the other? Are they different? Colonial imaginary and institutionalized racism.
Okay, thank you. So when you look at colonial imaginary, remember that we defined in the beginning that an imaginary is a social construct. So the whole operation of coloniality, it was formed on binaries, right, which differentiated between European and non-European, which these binaries amounted to subject, object, knowing, and unknowing. And I'm assuming here that hopefully you'd know what I'm just talking about there. And then, so when you look at now racism, it's almost like for me, it's almost like a chicken and egg kind of thing, because to maintain the colonial imaginary, you have to it involves racialized bodies, gendered dichotomies, all those things, right? And at the same time, the colonial imaginary then works to perpetuate racism. I hope I'm making sense there. So when it comes to now institutionalized racism, these are now the taken for granted assumptions that have now actually become sedimented habits in how we do things within the institution, where we, in the end, don't actually recognize the violence in them. And so it's the work, they're separate, but they're so interrelated because they actually need each other to survive. Because once you unmask racism, then you, at the same time, you're unmasking all the other elements that perpetuate and facilitate its continued existence in institutions and structures. I don't know if someone else has anything to add.
Would any of you, the rest of you, like to pick up on that point? Institutional racism versus the colonial imaginary.
Sue, I can come in here. Thanks, Rudo.
Hey,
sorry,
Paul.
I joined very late. I had issues. I think if we, in the beginning of the chapter, the authors state very clearly that the university in its current form is a result of colonialism. We cannot think about the university in its current form without thinking colonial imaginary. So if that is the first point, that what we're dealing with today is a colonial structure and a colonial imaginary, then we should actually expect that racism is part of the DNA of this colonial racism, colonial imaginary. So we cannot have the one without the other. And that may actually, we address a much bigger evil here when we think we can de-racialize a colonial university or colonial institution.
Thanks, Paul. Temwa has put the publication details into the chat bar, and we'll all definitely be looking out for it. Essays on the uptake, use, and impact of research on higher education. There's a question that jumped into my mind and actually was picked up on in an email by someone prior to this session, and I think it was Temwa at the end of his presentation says, you know, that by reflecting on these issues, we need to ask why we're doing research and how we're doing research and who does the research. And I thought back to when I was a brand new lecturer, and I had a male principal of a school who wanted to do research on why schoolgirls in his school were falling pregnant. But it was very clear that he had very strong, very negative views about these young women falling pregnant. And I was outraged at the thought that he could be the one that went and did this research. But now I find myself increasingly thinking, is there potential for us to fall into sort of radical standpoint theory, where only a Black lesbian can research Black lesbians? Is that ever a problem? Or should we accept that that is the case? That if you are doing research that is specifically about the experience of being, then you need to be able to genuinely represent that experience of being. And that takes me to Paul's comment about the sort of how we are doing voiceovers for our participants when our participants are expressing themselves in a different language. So my question to you is one that certainly often comes up in these conversations in the media, where people are, oh, you know, it's just, you're going to get to a standpoint where only a person represented in that group may do that research. So that's my question. I'm not sure if I phrased it as a question, but do you think that is the case? And where are the boundaries of who may do research within which groups?
May I
Thanks,
take a
Temwa.
step on it? Yeah, I think it would be... Okay, I think it would be unfortunate if we reached that stage whereby I would say people will undertake certain type of research because of their race or sexual orientation. But I think the key question that we ask throughout the discussions in the chapter is that when we undertake research, we should be aware, or rather we should be sensitive of how we present those that we are researching, and not to allow our own personal biases to overshadow the existence, the well-being, and what is represented in the data. It's a very difficult thing on how one may decide what is valid data and what is invalid data. So I think the key issue for me personally is that when we undertake research, is that we should be aware of these potential biases that researchers may have because of their privilege as researchers to name the data and how we define the data. But I think it would be unfortunate if we do reach a stage whereby only Black people do Black-related research, if there is such a thing as Black-related research, because we're all humans, you know. Anyways, thanks.
Thanks so much, Temwa. Very useful response. The other provocative question that I often hear people use to push back at these kinds of criticisms that you are raising is the idea that, you know, research is meant to be destabilizing and upsetting. It's meant to challenge us. Now, for me, it's very clear where that line is. It's very clear what is a pedagogy of discomfort, which is a necessary sense of being exposed to alternative views that do make us uncomfortable, versus what is a pedagogy of colonialism or racism. But yeah, that's just the other argument that that I know sometimes comes up, that, well, if you know, that the resistance is to alternative perspectives, and that the moment the university starts to say you can't do this kind of research or that kind of research, it's no longer a university in the sense of being open to universal different opinions. For me, that the line is fairly clear, but I know that it's not that clear for everyone. Again, I'm not sure how well I've articulated that particular argument, but it's certainly something. Roxana says, I've come across that argument several times and I don't have a clear answer. But the reflection goes to a deep question of positionality and how my power of conducting particular research. Yeah. So I guess it's about reflection.
Sure. This is Ntsundeni.
Yes, please do.
Yes, I just wanted to respond. Like Temwa said, it will be very unfortunate if we get to a point where we stop people from doing research because their demographics do not match or agree with the demographics of the subjects that they're doing research on. But again, it's those preconceived ideas and notions about the subjects that are problematic. I can give you an example of early in my honors, we were doing research in Bushbuck Ridge. And according to the state essay, this is one of the poorest areas in Limpopo or South Africa in total. So we went there already with that preconceived perception that these people are poor, they don't know what they want, and we have, as researchers, know what is needed and so on. We went around the village interviewing people, and one of the questions was, what can the government do to improve your life? To my surprise, most of the respondents, the villagers, said, we don't need anything, we are fine. Our life is great the way it is. You know, and I was shocked because our perception of their livelihood was that they are poor, but they don't see it that way. So that is actually a sort of evidence of how, as the researchers, we have the power over the subjects, and we already think we know better than them, or we can describe them better than they can describe their own situation. Thanks.
Thank you. So it really is about challenging our own assumptions and really being careful not to enforce those onto the data, which I think is the point Sim is making there about, sort of forcing a line of argument that it may not be what the data is saying. And Paul's comment, I really like this idea of thinking of research as the surgeon cutting open the body, and often the surgeon cuts open the body because that's the right thing to do and it's necessary, but it does cause trauma, and as a result we should cut very, very carefully, respectfully.
Can I also add?
Yes,
yes, talking about data, I just want to add that also interpretation of statistical results can delegitimize specific bodies or results or people given results. So, meaning in statistical analysis, we use certain assumptions prior to the analysis of data or inferential statistics, which may differ according to statistical approach. So there are certain assumptions that should be met on commonly used as normalities, linearity, or equality of variance, or any assumptions for that approach. So violation of these assumptions in the analysis impact your ability to trust your results or draw conclusions. So therefore, sometimes researchers having the power will remove outliers or extreme values, which are data points which are just different from other data points or just different from other research objects. So this influences the data sets, and also as a statistical analysis, trimming big data, removing those outliers so that they don't influence so that you can have statistical significant data. So you're removing outliers in the data to have statistical significant data, because outliers increase variability in the data, which decrease statistical power, which then means removing outliers means this can cause your results to be statistically significant. So the interpretation of these results can delegitimize specific bodies, of which these outliers can have something scientifically interesting or important on the data. So I just, on a slide that Temwa was talking about, excluding important information or important issues, statistical analysis as well can exclude important information, and which can be violent, which is also inherently, but it's not negative like we say. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Benjamin, because of course we have been talking primarily, at least I think we have, about sort of qualitative, experiential, interpretive kind of research. But as you point out, really all methodologies have researchers, and those researchers are making decisions. And in doing so, whether it's cleaning data or imposing a theory, they are implicated in the research. I think that's really useful for us to think about this across different kinds of research methodologies. And I think we should probably wrap up, but I'm going to wrap up by drawing together two comments at the end here, and that's by Patrick and Rita. And Patrick says, how are the terms research and truth related? Well, that could be a few hour long discussion on its own. But in terms of what we've been talking about today, how do the terms research and truth relate to each other? And then Rita's comment is that, you know, surely whenever we impose a theory onto data, we are suggesting that there is an attempt to get to a stronger, more powerful, more in-depth level of understanding beyond our flawed, biased, prejudiced, everyday eyes. So can I ask if any of you would like to comment on the endeavor to use research to get to truth, whatever that may be.
Well, as you say, Sue, it would really take a long time to try and get into that debate, because while, as Roxanne raised there, that decolonial lenses are skeptical of universal truth, the argument also is that it's not an arguing against rational thought and what is truth, but sort of taking a step back and thinking, who defines what is rational, who defines what is common sense, and who defines what is truth. So she rightly put there that universal truth. So truth is very, how can I put it, provincial, specific, and it can't just be isolated in one, geographical area where it's the West that defines what is truth and who is the valued and legitimate knower. And that's what we've seen that is prevalent within the colonial imaginary, because it actually uses that as the starting point of defining where all knowledge is wholly, in the white subject. So I just I think that's what I would say about truth. So we have to question our taken for granted assumptions of what entails validity in knowledge, because at times we actually don't end up valuing the lived experiences of people if they don't fit into our taken for granted assumptions of what is actually valid. This is where we find ourselves cleaning data, but in actual fact, what we're doing is actually violating someone's lived experiences and delegitimating their lived experiences as something that can't be known or understood. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Rudo. I think that's an incredibly concise way of dealing with a very complex issue, and a good point at which we should draw this conversation to a close. I can already see from the many thanks in the chat that people have certainly found this packed with food for thought. We're all really looking forward to reading the chapter, and as soon as it's out, we'll make sure we get our hands on it. And I think it's going to be a very useful for reading for all of us who are doing research, whether it's research on higher education or any other form of research in higher education. So we are hugely grateful to all of you for agreeing to come along and sharing your thoughts with us today. You are all welcome to undo your microphones just to say goodbye and wish you well. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi.